Daniel Carter stepped into Rose Hill Diner, his worn navy coat buttoned tight against the morning chill. The diner was quiet, nearly empty except for a couple of patrons sipping coffee and a waitress casually flipping through a magazine at the counter. Daniel nodded at her and made his way to a small corner table by the window. He rested his hands on the table, glancing at his watch. His son, Elijah, was running late, but Daniel didn't mind. He'd long since grown used to waiting. The subtle weight of stares brushed over him, brief glances from across the room. Daniel noticed but didn't dwell on it. Rose Hill was a predominantly white part of town, and he didn't often find himself in this neighborhood. Still, it was just another diner in another place. He signaled to the waitress. "Just a coffee, please," Daniel said, offering a polite smile. The waitress nodded, pouring him a cup without speaking. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring its warmth as he gazed out the window at the empty street beyond. The soft chime of the door opening caught his attention. He glanced over his shoulder as a tall figure entered. A police officer with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl. The officer's eyes scanned the room until they settled on Daniel. Rather than looking away, the officer strode toward him, his boots thudding against the linoleum. Stopping at Daniel's table, the officer crossed his arms, casting a shadow over the steaming cup. "You lost or something?" the officer asked, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Daniel looked up calmly, his face unreadable. "Just waiting for my son," he replied with quiet composure. The officer's brow creased. "Your son, huh?" He snorted, glancing around as if to confirm Daniel's story. "Don't see many folks like you around here. How long you planning on waiting?" Daniel raised his coffee and took a measured sip before answering. "As long as I need to, officer." The officer smirked, lips curling into something just shy of a sneer. "Well, this ain't really the place for loitering. People around here get uneasy, you know." Daniel's gaze stayed steady. "I'm not loitering. Just having coffee." The officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Let me see some ID, old man." Daniel didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a worn leather wallet. Without a word, he slid his veteran ID card across the table. The officer snatched it up, barely glancing at it before flicking it back onto the table with casual disdain. "A vet?" The disbelief in his tone was obvious. "I'm not buying it." Daniel didn't flinch. "Believe it or not, I know who I am." The officer let out a short, sharp laugh, loud enough to draw glances from nearby patrons. "I know your type. Always acting polite, pretending you belong." Daniel's patience held, but only just. "You have a problem with me, officer?" The officer leaned down further, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Problem? Yeah, I got a problem. Folks like you waltzing into places you don't belong, thinking you're entitled to sit anywhere you please." Daniel's jaw tensed, but he kept his tone even. "I'm just here for a cup of coffee. Not looking for trouble." "Trouble finds you though, doesn't it?" The officer sneered. "Maybe it's time you took the hint before I make it official." Daniel glanced at his watch again, wondering how much longer Elijah would be. "I think I'll wait right here," he replied, voice calm but firm. The officer's eyes darkened. "Suit yourself, old man, but I'll be watching." The officer's name tag read Briggs, and Daniel noted it as the man loomed over his table. Briggs leaned in, his face mere inches from Daniel's. "I already told you once," Briggs said coldly. "I won't tell you again. You're not wanted here. People like you don't just sit wherever they please." Daniel looked up at him, the calmness in his expression unwavering, but there was steel behind his eyes. "I'm waiting for my son. I've got every right to sit here and have a cup of coffee." Briggs let out a bitter chuckle. "Right?" He leaned closer, his smile twisting into a sneer. "Rights are for people who earn them, not washed-up old men with fake IDs." Daniel's voice remained steady. "It's not fake." Daniel's voice was firm, unwavering. "I earned that ID, just like every other veteran who served this country." Officer Briggs narrowed his eyes, his lip curling. "Sure you did. Guys like you always have a story, don't they? Always talking about what you earned, acting like it makes you special." He leaned back, glaring down his nose at Daniel. "Maybe you didn't earn anything but a one-way ticket out of here." Daniel's tone hardened. "I served with respect, and I didn't walk in here looking for trouble. I came for a quiet cup of coffee." "Quiet?" Briggs barked out a laugh, the sound harsh and cutting. "Oh, you're making plenty of noise just by sitting there." sitting like you think you belong. With a rough flick of his hand, Briggs shoved Daniel's coffee mug across the table. The cup wobbled before tipping over, spilling coffee onto Daniel's coat and dripping onto the floor. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He glanced briefly at the stain spreading over his coat, but didn't react. Briggs leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "You're making this place look bad. Places like this don't need your kind dragging them down." His words carried loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. A few cast nervous glances but quickly turned away. Daniel's eyes met Briggs's without faltering. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "I'm not going anywhere, officer. I'll leave when my son gets here, not because you're throwing a tantrum." Briggs's nostrils flared, his face darkening. "A tantrum?" he spat. "You don't get to talk to me like that, old man. I'm the law here. You don't sit around disrespecting me like you think you're untouchable." "Respect is earned," Daniel replied, his tone sharp and deliberate. Briggs's face twisted with rage. "Earned? You think you can lecture me on respect? Coming in here, acting high and mighty with your so-called veteran status? You think that makes you better than everyone else?" "I think it means I deserve to be here just like anyone else," Daniel said calmly, though he could feel his patience thinning. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "You deserve something, all right?" He leaned in even closer, his breath hot and bitter. "People like you always think the rules don't apply, acting like you're above them." "I don't think I'm above anything," Daniel replied, his voice tightening. "I know my rights. Sitting here, having a cup of coffee isn't a crime." Briggs's sneer deepened, and without warning, he leaned forward and spat. The glob landed squarely on Daniel's coat. The diner froze. The waitress by the counter gasped audibly, stepping back as if shocked by what she had just witnessed. A heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel's jaw clenched, his hands tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles white, but he didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on Briggs, steady and unwavering. "Disgusting, isn't it?" Briggs sneered, his smile smug and mocking. "That's what you are, something to spit on, something that doesn't belong." Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath. "Is that what you think makes you better? That badge?" Briggs's grin widened. "It's not the badge, old man, it's what I represent, order, control. Things you people don't understand, and I'm telling you, get up and leave, or I'll drag you out myself." Daniel's voice barely rose above a whisper, but every word was clear. "I've faced worse than you, officer, I'm not moving." Briggs's expression darkened, his hand clamped down on Daniel's shoulder, squeezing hard. "You're making a mistake," Briggs hissed. "Respect means knowing when to back down." "Authority isn't a right to abuse people," Daniel said, his voice like iron. "If you think pushing me around makes you stronger, you don't understand respect." Briggs's face contorted with anger. Without warning, he shoved the table sideways. The loud scrape of wood on tile filled the diner as Daniel's chair rocked. He caught himself just before falling. Breathing hard, Briggs grabbed Daniel's shoulder and yanked him to his feet. "I told you to leave," he shouted, his voice echoing. "You don't belong here, and I don't want to see you again. Got it?" Daniel stood firm, steadying himself. His voice was calm but sharp as steel. "I don't answer to men like you. I answer to my own principles, and I'm not backing down." Briggs's eyes flashed with fury. "All right, tough guy. Let's see how brave you are in a cell." He yanked Daniel's arms behind his back, snapping cold steel cuffs over his wrists. The diner patrons watched, stunned and silent, as Briggs led Daniel through the door and toward his squad car. Daniel's wrists strained against the cold cuffs, but his weathered face held steady, though the cracks in his composure were starting to show. Officer Briggs shoved him toward the squad car, his triumphant smirk stretching wider with each step. "You think this makes you tough, don't you?" Daniel's voice was low but simmering with restrained fury. "Throwing your weight around, roughing up an old man. That what makes you feel like a big shot?" Briggs barely glanced back. "Keep talking, old man. Won't change where you're headed." Daniel let out a dry, bitter laugh, his voice cutting through the cool air. "Where I'm going? I've been places you couldn't last a day in, boy. I've stood toe-to-toe with men twice your size, and none of them treated me with half the disrespect you have." Briggs halted, his boots grinding to a stop. He spun around, eyes darkening. "Disrespect?" Briggs laughed, the sound empty. "You think you deserve respect? Sitting there like you're better than everyone else? Daniel's eyes narrowed. Better than everyone? His voice rose slightly. Look at you, strutting around all puffed up in that uniform like it's armor, like it makes you somebody. But deep down, you're nothing but a bully with a badge. Briggs's grip on Daniel's arm tightened, his knuckles whitening. Watch it, old man. You're already in enough trouble. No, you watch it, Daniel snapped, yanking his arm free despite the cuffs cutting into his skin. You think this uniform gives you power? That I'm supposed to tremble just because you flashed that badge? Not today. Briggs's face reddened, his breaths coming faster as Daniel's words landed like blows. He glanced over his shoulder, noticing the stares of patrons and bystanders lingering outside the diner. Uneasy eyes shifted between him and Daniel, silently bearing witness. Shut your mouth, Briggs growled under his breath, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. I'm warning you. Or what? Daniel cut in sharply, stepping closer. You've already thrown me around like I'm garbage. What's next? You gonna beat an old man in front of all these people just because I told you the truth? Briggs's eyes flashed, but he said nothing. Instead, he spat. The glob of spit struck Daniel's coat, sliding down the worn fabric. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The small crowd gasped, and Daniel heard someone mutter in disbelief. Daniel's gaze lowered to his coat, his jaw tightening. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept still, the slow rise and fall of his chest the only sign of the fire burning inside him. You think that makes you powerful? Daniel's voice trembled, not from fear but from restrained rage. Spitting on a man? That's not strength, that's cowardice. Briggs's smug expression flickered, but he held his ground. You don't know a damn thing about me, old man, he hissed. You're nobody, just some relic, wasting space and making people uncomfortable. Daniel's eyes locked onto Briggs's, cold and unrelenting. Oh, I know enough, he shot back, his voice sharp. I know you're terrified. You hide behind that badge because without it, you're nothing. A scared little man desperate for control. Briggs's face went crimson. He stepped forward, his voice barely more than a hiss. Keep talking, and I'll make sure you spend the night in that cell. I'll throw away the key if I have to. Daniel squared his shoulders, standing taller. Go ahead. Lock me up, if that's all you know how to do. But remember this, every person watching right now knows who the real coward is. And it's not the man in cuffs. Briggs's lip curled in frustration. Without another word, he shoved Daniel roughly toward the squad car. You're done, Briggs spat, yanking open the door. I'm putting an end to this, right here, right now. Daniel pulled back slightly, meeting Briggs's furious gaze with his own fire. You don't get to end anything, he growled, his voice rising with every word. You think that badge makes you someone important? I earned the right to sit in that diner. I served this country. Men like me bled and died so you could strut around pretending to be someone. Briggs slammed the car door open wider and practically shoved Daniel inside. Get in the car and shut up. Even as the door swung toward him, Daniel leaned forward, his voice razor-sharp and unwavering. I may be cuffed, but I'm not the one cowering. You are. You're scared, officer. Scared because deep down, you know I'm right. Shut up, Briggs barked, his frustration boiling over. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame, storming around the vehicle to the driver's side, his hands trembling against the wheel. From the back seat, Daniel's eyes locked onto Briggs's reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't look away. You can cuff me, officer, Daniel said, his voice cutting through the silence, but you'll never break me. Daniel Carter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath steady but shallow. From the back seat, Daniel's gaze locked onto Briggs through the rearview mirror, his eyes unflinching. You're afraid, Daniel said, his voice piercing the silence. Afraid that one day, people are going to see you for who you really are, a sad, pathetic little man hiding behind a badge. Briggs's knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the wheel. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His eyes, however, flickered with anger as he pulled out of the diner parking lot. Daniel held his head high, heart pounding with a mix of fury and satisfaction. He knew he'd struck a nerve, and though the line had been crossed, he didn't care. No man, uniform or not, was going to silence him. Neither of them spoke during the drive to the station. The air between them felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Daniel could see it in Briggs's reflection, the officer's twitching eye, the stiff set of his shoulders. Briggs wouldn't forget this anytime soon. When they arrived, Briggs yanked Daniel out of the car with more force than necessary, guiding him roughly into the station. Daniel's wrists ached from the tight cuffs digging into his skin, but he stayed silent, refusing to give Briggs the satisfaction of seeing him wince. Inside, Briggs shoved him into an empty holding cell. The iron door swung shut with a loud, jarring clang, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. For a moment, Daniel listened to the hollow ring of the door, his breath steady, as if counting the reverberations. Briggs stood just outside the bars, arms crossed, his usual sneer plastered across his face. "Bet you're feeling pretty high and mighty now, huh?" Briggs taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "All that tough talk, and here you are, right where you belong." Daniel slowly lifted his gaze to meet Briggs's, his voice low and calm, cut through the air like a blade. "You think locking me up makes you powerful?" His eyes narrowed. "You think this cell makes you the bigger man?" Briggs's smirk widened. "I think it reminds you who's in charge. You're nothing, Carter, just another troublemaker who thought he could sit wherever he wanted." Daniel's expression hardened. "I was sitting in a diner, waiting for my son. I didn't cause a scene. You did. But here you are, playing the hero, acting like this is some victory." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "It's pathetic." The word struck Briggs harder than Daniel expected. His face stiffened, his arms unfolding as he gripped the cold steel bars between them. "Pathetic?" Briggs spat. "You're the one sitting in a cell? And you've got the nerve to call me pathetic?" Daniel's eyes darkened, his voice sharpening. "I've seen worse. I've seen men who thought power was something you used to break others, men who thought belittling and hurting people made them strong. They were cowards, every single one of them. Just like you." Briggs's grip on the bars tightened, his knuckles pale and rigid. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he hissed. "You think you're special because of your service? Because you've seen combat? You're just an old man who can't accept his time's up." Daniel let out a hollow chuckle, leaning back against the cold wall. "Entitled," he repeated, shaking his head. "That's rich, coming from a man who hides behind his badge because it's the only way people pay him any mind." Briggs's fists clenched, his face reddening. "Watch yourself, Carter." "I'm not the one who needs to," Daniel replied, his eyes locking onto Briggs's with quiet defiance. "I belong here just as much as anyone else. You're the one who made it about something else. That's your weakness, Briggs, not mine." Briggs's face twisted with barely restrained fury. "You're done," he muttered, stepping back. His voice dropped to a low growl. "Rot here and think about that." He turned on his heel and stalked away, his footsteps echoing down the dim hallway, growing quieter with each step. Left alone, Daniel let the silence settle over him like a heavy blanket. The cell was small and bare, the walls cold and uninviting, the bench hard beneath him. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed faintly, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. It was a space meant to make men feel small, to remind them of their isolation. But Daniel Carter was not a man easily broken. He lowered himself onto the bench, his back straight and his chin held high. He breathed deeply, the fire in his chest still burning, but tempered by years of restraint. As he sat, memories stirred in the silence. The weight of a rifle, the cold of early morning patrols, the faces of men he'd fought beside, some who never made it home. Each memory reminded him why he had served, why he had stood his ground. It wasn't just about coffee. It was about respect, about dignity, about the right to sit in any diner, in any town, without needing to justify his presence. Daniel Carter had fought for those rights, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Officer Briggs, strip them away. The anger from Briggs's treatment simmered in Daniel Carter's chest, but now it was tempered with resolve. He wouldn't allow Briggs or anyone else to make him feel small. Daniel had fought for his right to exist freely, to be treated with dignity, and he knew the truth would surface. He had raised a son who understood justice, a man who stood unwaveringly for what was right. And Daniel knew that soon enough, his son would arrive. In the cold silence of the cell, Daniel sat tall. His heart still burned with fire, undimmed by the passage of time or the weight of the cell's unforgiving bench beneath him. His patience held, but anticipation stirred within. Suddenly, the quiet was broken. Voices echoed down the corridor, sharp and forceful. A commotion erupted, followed by hurried footsteps. Daniel straightened, his pulse quickening. He knew that voice. It was Elijah. What the hell is going on here? Elijah Carter's voice carried down the hall like a hammer striking steel. Even out of sight, it commanded attention, heavy with authority and barely contained fury. The station shifted uneasily. Officers exchanged glances, their murmurs uncertain. Near the front desk, Briggs, who had been leaning back with his usual smugness, straightened abruptly. His expression faltered as recognition dawned. The color drained from his face. Elijah stepped into view, his eyes like ice, his broad shoulders squared. The air in the room seemed to thin. Briggs swallowed, his arrogance fading as he forced himself into an attempt at calm. He approached, his voice measured but unsteady. "Captain Carter, I didn't expect to see you here." Elijah's gaze locked onto him, sharp enough to cut glass. "Didn't expect me?" he repeated, his words dripping with contempt. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? You thought no one would say anything about you manhandling my father and locking him in a cell?" Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face flushed as he scrambled to justify himself. "Sir, I didn't realize he was your father." Elijah took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "That's the problem. You didn't look at him. You saw what you wanted to see, a man you thought you could bully, and you thought you'd get away with it." Briggs's pale face twisted as he struggled to hold his composure. "Captain, with all due respect," he was being belligerent, disrespectful. "I was keeping the peace. People at the diner were uncomfortable." Elijah's tone cut through the room like a knife. "The only one making people uncomfortable was you, Briggs." Briggs's mouth opened to argue, but Elijah's glare stopped him cold. "I've spoken to every witness," Elijah continued, his voice deadly calm. "My father was sitting quietly, minding his own business, until you decided to throw your weight around, and instead of doing your job, you humiliated him, you spat on him, and you dragged him here because you wanted to feel powerful." Briggs's defiance flickered, but he pressed on. "Sir, I didn't know." "It wouldn't have mattered," Elijah snapped. "You didn't see a man. You saw someone who you thought didn't belong." Briggs's jaw tightened, but his voice wavered. "He refused to leave when I asked. I was following procedure, Captain. He was uncooperative." Elijah's fists clenched, his knuckles white. "Uncooperative," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You spat on him, you shoved him, you threw him into a cell like an animal, and you call that procedure?" The room was so still that the hum of the overhead lights felt deafening. Briggs shifted, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I was doing my job, sir." He acted like he was above authority. Elijah took another step, his face inches from Briggs's. Above authority? His words were barely above a whisper, but each one struck like a hammer. "You think my father, who fought for this country, was above authority? He sat in a diner. You harassed him, and you think he disrespected you?" Briggs stumbled back a step, sweat beginning to bead along his brow. "Captain, you didn't just disrespect him," Elijah interrupted, his voice rising with each word. "You disrespected the uniform, the badge, and every decent officer who actually upholds the law instead of hiding behind it." Briggs's bravado crumbled. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the other officers remained silent. Their gazes were fixed firmly on their desks, unwilling to meet his desperate glances. "With all due respect, Captain," Briggs stammered. He was difficult. Elijah's stare bore down on him like the weight of the entire station. "Difficult," he said slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "Difficult isn't a justification for spitting on a man. Difficult isn't an excuse for abuse. The truth is you couldn't handle the fact that he didn't cower when you puffed up your chest." Briggs's face turned crimson, but he said nothing. Elijah leaned in just enough for his voice to lower. "You think you're untouchable because of that badge," Elijah growled. "But let me make one thing clear. You will answer for what you've done. And when this is over, I promise you, Briggs, that badge will no longer be yours to hide behind." Briggs's face twisted with embarrassment, but he nodded stiffly, understanding there was no escaping the weight of Elijah's words. As Elijah turned, his gaze softened slightly as he approached the holding cell. "Dad?" Elijah said, his voice calm but filled with quiet urgency. "Let's go." Daniel rose slowly, meeting his son's gaze with a steady look of pride and gratitude. Without another word, Elijah unlocked the cell, and Daniel stepped out. As they walked past the officers, Briggs still rooted to the floor, Elijah spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Respect isn't demanded," Elijah said, glancing Briggs's way. "It's earned." Elijah's glare burned into Briggs as the officer shifted nervously. The silence in the station felt suffocating. Every eye discreetly focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. "My father didn't act like he was above authority," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "He acted like a man with dignity, and you couldn't stand it, could you? You hated that he wouldn't bow down, that he wouldn't let you push him around." Briggs's eyes dropped to the floor, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Elijah's posture softened slightly, but the restrained fury in his voice lingered. "You don't get to mean anything anymore, Briggs. You crossed a line, not just with him, but with every person who's ever trusted you to uphold the law. You've shown everyone here that you don't deserve to wear that badge." Briggs's mouth opened, desperate for a defense. "Captain, I'm a good officer. I've been here for years. This was just one mistake." Elijah's eyes sharpened, his tone fierce. "A mistake?" He took a step closer. "A mistake is forgetting paperwork or misfiling evidence. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You abused your power. You let prejudice cloud your judgment, and you humiliated a man who deserved your respect. You treated him like less than human because of your own bias." The room hung heavy in silence. Officers nearby stood frozen, their expressions shifting between discomfort and quiet recognition of the truth. Elijah spoke. No one met Briggs's gaze. Briggs swallowed hard, his voice faint. "So what now?" Elijah's gaze hardened. "Now you take responsibility. You're going to face a formal review, and if this department has any shred of justice left, you'll be gone by the end of the week. We don't need officers like you. Not here, not anywhere." Briggs's face burned with a mixture of shame and anger, but he nodded stiffly. He realized he had no options left. Elijah took one last step back, the intensity in his eyes unwavering. "And if you think this is over," he said, his voice low and cold, "think again. You will answer for everything. Every word, every action. You've disgraced the badge, and you don't get to walk away without consequences." Briggs lowered his head, his defiance shattering under the weight of Elijah's words. Turning away from Briggs, Elijah strode toward the holding cell. His eyes softened as he approached. Daniel, calm and steady, stood to meet his son's gaze. The lock clicked open, and Daniel stepped out with quiet dignity. Without another word, Elijah led his father out of the station. The tension in the room didn't lift as they left. Officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They all knew justice had begun its course. Outside, the cool night air met them like a welcome relief. Elijah guided Daniel to a quiet corner away from prying eyes, the weight of the incident hanging between them. Elijah finally broke the silence. His voice, usually confident and commanding, carried a rare hesitation. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner, that you had to sit in that cell at all." Daniel placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. "You did right by me," Daniel replied calmly. "You didn't let him get away with it. That's what matters. You can't be everywhere, son, but you can set things right when it counts." Elijah's jaw tightened as his gaze drifted toward the distant streetlights. "I can't believe he treated you like that," he muttered, anger flickering in his eyes once again. "I knew Briggs had issues, but I never thought he'd go that far. He spat on you, Dad." Daniel's expression hardened for a moment before he exhaled slowly, keeping his voice measured. "Men like him see power as a weapon, not a responsibility. That badge gave him cover, an excuse to justify his anger. Wearing a uniform doesn't make someone honorable, Elijah." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. "The way he spoke to you, I can't stand it. He had no right to treat you or anyone like that. Especially after everything you've given to this country." He shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "I've worked my entire career trying to prove officers don't have to be like that we can be better." Daniel's eyes softened as he gave his son a small, reassuring nod. "And you've done exactly that. Today, you showed everyone that you won't tolerate injustice, even when it comes from inside your own department. That's more powerful than anything Briggs will ever understand." Elijah drew in a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to go through this, especially not because of one of my officers. When I put on this badge, I swore I'd be different. That I'd make sure people like you didn't have to face this kind of hatred again." Daniel met his son's gaze, pride evident in his eyes. "You've kept that promise, Elijah, and you showed it again today." Elijah glanced down, his shoulders tense with lingering frustration. "It shouldn't have happened at all." Daniel patted his shoulder, his voice steady and resolute. "It happened, but the important thing is you didn't let it slide. You made it clear that respect is earned, not demanded." Elijah nodded, his resolve solidifying. "Tomorrow, there's going to be a formal review. I'll make sure Briggs answers for everything. He's not getting away with this." Daniel gave his son an approving nod. "Then do what needs to be done. I have faith in you." The two stood quietly under the night sky, the bond between them stronger than ever, rooted not just in family, but in their shared commitment to justice. Elijah stood with his father outside the station, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. Daniel's eyes met his son's, pride clear in his gaze. "You've done more than enough today, Elijah," Daniel said, his voice steady but warm. "You showed everyone that respect is earned, not demanded. I know you wanted to protect me, but don't carry this as your burden. You stood up, and that's more than a father could ever ask for." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of what had happened settle. Finally, Elijah nodded, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "Tomorrow, we'll hold the formal review," he said firmly. "Briggs is going to answer for what he did." Daniel gave a small approving nod. "Then go and do what needs to be done. I have faith in you, son." Their eyes met in a quiet, resolute exchange. This wasn't just about family, it was about justice and principle. Their bond, forged in mutual respect, had never felt stronger. The following day, the atmosphere in the station's conference room was tense. Officers and senior staff filled the seats, along with a representative from Internal Affairs. Officer Briggs sat at one end of the long table, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced around. His face was pale, his confidence from the previous day visibly drained. Elijah entered the room, his expression calm but unreadable. He took his seat across from Briggs, his gaze unwavering. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The Internal Affairs representative, a stern woman with sharp eyes, cleared her throat. "We are convened today to review the actions of Officer Ryan Briggs regarding the incident involving Mr. Daniel Carter at the Rose Hill Diner. This review will determine if Officer Briggs's conduct was consistent with departmental policies and whether he remains fit to serve." Briggs's defiant posture from the day before had vanished. He avoided eye contact with Elijah, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He tried to muster confidence, but his voice cracked slightly. "With all due respect, I don't believe this review is necessary. I was following procedure. I acted within my authority." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but brimming with restrained fury. "Following procedure?" His eyes narrowed. "You mean spitting on an elderly man, roughing him up, and throwing him in a cell was part of your official training?" Briggs's face reddened, but he pressed on. "Sir, he was uncooperative, disrespectful. He refused to leave when asked. I felt it was my duty to remove him for the safety of the other patrons." Elijah's voice dropped, colder now. "For their safety? You expect us to believe that a 70-year-old man, quietly drinking coffee, posed a danger to anyone, or is it just that you didn't think he belonged there?" Briggs's eyes flicked to the other officers seated around the table, silently searching for support. But the only thing he found was a room full of disapproving stares. The officers sat stiffly, their expressions stoic. I thought I was acting in the best interest of the situation," Briggs muttered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know he was your father, Captain." Elijah's eyes hardened. "That's the problem, Briggs," he said sharply. "This isn't about him being my father. It's about the fact that you abused your authority. You thought humiliating him was acceptable because he didn't fit into the image of who you thought should be sitting in that diner." Briggs's shoulders tensed, his face tightening as he looked down at his hands, which were now clenched in his lap. "Captain, I didn't mean." "You thought you could treat him like dirt because no one would hold you accountable." Elijah cut him off, his voice like a blade. "You thought no one would care. Now you're sitting here, trying to justify it as duty. The internal affairs representative leaned forward, her gaze piercing through Briggs. Officer Briggs, she began, her voice firm, multiple witnesses reported that you insulted Mr. Carter, spat on him, and used unnecessary force. These are serious allegations. Do you have anything else to add in your defense? Briggs swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as his eyes flicked desperately between Elijah and the rest of the room. I've been dedicated to this job for years, he stammered. I've given everything to this department. One mistake shouldn't ruin my career. Elijah's eyes remained cold and unrelenting. This wasn't a mistake, Briggs, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. It was a choice. A deliberate choice to demean and belittle someone who had done nothing wrong. You abused the authority that uniform gave you. The room fell into silence, the weight of Elijah's words settling heavily over everyone present. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats but didn't speak. The quiet spoke volumes, Briggs's head lowered in shame, the fight draining from his posture. He began weakly, but his voice faltered. Elijah didn't look away. You chose to treat my father like he didn't belong, he continued, and now you're going to face the consequences of that choice. Briggs sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale and drawn as Elijah's words hung heavy in the room. His once defiant posture had finally crumbled. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes flickering with the weight of regret. I didn't mean for it to go that far, Briggs mumbled, barely above a whisper. Elijah's gaze sharpened, his eyes hard as stone. Maybe you didn't mean it, he replied, but that doesn't change the fact that you did it. You betrayed the trust this community placed in you, and now everyone here knows you're unfit to wear that badge. The silence that followed was absolute. Officers sitting around the table nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of Elijah's words. There was no room for doubt. The Internal Affairs representative, Miss Harper, glanced at Briggs, her expression grave. Officer Briggs, she began, her tone cold and formal. Based on the evidence presented and the testimonies provided, it is the recommendation of this review board that your employment be terminated, effective immediately. Briggs's face twisted as the reality struck him like a hammer. He looked around the room, searching for support or sympathy, but there was none. His colleagues averted their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze. Slowly, Briggs rose from his seat. His mouth opened as if to protest, but the words died in his throat. With one last look of resentment, he turned and left the room. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, each step punctuating his fall from grace. Elijah's eyes swept across the room as he addressed the officers who remained. Let this serve as a reminder, he said, his voice firm. Our badge doesn't give us the right to decide who deserves respect. It gives us the responsibility to uphold respect for everyone in our community. If anyone here thinks they're above that responsibility, you're free to follow Briggs out the door. No one spoke. The only response was the quiet, somber nods of officers who understood the gravity of his words. As Elijah rose to leave, he felt the bittersweet weight of justice settling over him. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a necessary one. Justice, while often delayed, had been served, and his father would know that his dignity had not been disregarded. Later that evening, Elijah pulled into his father's driveway. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated Daniel Carter, who sat quietly on the steps. His calm, steady expression had not wavered, even after everything that had happened. Elijah felt a wave of pride as he stepped out of his car, knowing the strength and resilience his father carried. Daniel looked up, nodding slightly, as Elijah approached and sat beside him. So? Daniel asked, his voice low but expectant. What did they decide about Briggs? Elijah exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face before answering. They terminated him, Dad. Effective immediately. Internal Affairs backed it all the way. Briggs won't be wearing that badge again. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, a grim satisfaction flickering across his face. Good, he said. He didn't deserve to wear it in the first place. For a moment, they sat in silence, the quiet night air wrapping around them. The distant chirping of crickets filled the space as Elijah gathered his thoughts. Dad, Elijah began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I meant every word I said during that review. I wanted them to understand how far Briggs crossed the line. That kind of behavior has no place in our department. Daniel's gaze lingered on his son, unreadable but full of unspoken gratitude. "You stood up," he said softly. "You made sure they knew it wasn't just some mistake Briggs could sweep under the rug. You did right by me, Elijah." Elijah looked down, his shoulders tightening. "The way he treated you, Dad, it makes me sick. To think someone like him had that kind of power. To throw his weight around, all because he didn't think you belonged in that diner." His fists clenched. He thought he was untouchable. Daniel shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Elijah," he said gently, "Briggs isn't the first, and he won't be the last. That kind of hate doesn't just disappear because one badge is taken away. It's in the way people look at you, the assumptions they make, the way they glance at you like you're in the wrong place, just for sitting down to have a coffee." A surge of anger and helplessness rose in Elijah's chest. "It's disgusting, Dad. The idea that anyone could see you, or anyone else, as less than human just because of the color of your skin." His jaw tightened. "And what hurts even more is knowing people like him thought they could get away with it." Daniel let out a long sigh, his voice heavy with experience. "The world's still got a long way to go, son. Men like Briggs, they hide behind the rules, call it procedure, and pass off their hate as part of the job. And too often, people look the other way." Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I don't know how you do it, Dad. How you've carried this your whole life. After everything you've been through, after everything you've given, they still see you as less." Daniel's eyes hardened, but his voice remained steady. "That's exactly why I don't back down, Elijah. Because if I let men like Briggs decide where I belong, if I let them take my dignity, then I've already lost, and I'm not about to give them that." Elijah's gaze met his father's, admiration filling his chest. "You're right, Dad. They don't get to decide." Daniel patted Elijah's shoulder firmly. "And remember this, son, you're already making a difference. Today proved that. You stood your ground, not just for me but for everyone watching. That means something." Elijah nodded, his resolve solidifying. "Tomorrow, we start moving forward, but I'll make sure the department remembers what happened." Daniel gave a final nod, his pride evident. "Then do what needs to be done, Elijah. I trust you." As they sat quietly under the stars, Elijah knew that while the fight for justice wasn't over, his father's quiet strength would always guide him. Elijah glanced over at his father. His heart weighed down with frustration. The silence between them was thick, filled with thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. "I don't know how you do it, Dad," Elijah finally said, his voice low. "How you've dealt with this kind of ugliness your whole life. After everything you've been through, after everything you've given, they still see you as less." Daniel's eyes hardened, but his voice was steady and unshaken. "That's exactly why I don't back down, Elijah. If I let men like Briggs make me feel small, if I let them decide where I belong, then I'm giving them exactly what they want. And I won't do that. Not after the men I served with, not after the friends I lost. They deserve better. I deserve better." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words sinking in. His respect for Daniel deepened with every passing moment. "You're right, Dad, they do, and so do you." Elijah paused, his shoulders heavy with lingering disappointment. I wish it didn't have to be this way. I wish you didn't have to keep fighting, just to be treated like you belong." Daniel's gaze softened as he placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did your part today, son. You made sure Briggs faced consequences for his actions, and maybe, just maybe, someone else will think twice before treating the next person like they don't belong." Elijah drew in a deep breath, letting his father's words settle within him. "I want to believe that, Dad. I really do. I want to believe that what happened today will make a difference. But I know there are others out there just like him, waiting to pull the same stunt." Daniel nodded solemnly. "And that's why we keep standing up, Elijah. For every person who's felt unwelcome, for every man or woman who's ever been told they don't belong, we have to be the ones who show them that they do." The two men sat quietly, the cool night air wrapping around them. The weight of injustice, frustration, and bittersweet victory lingered. Yet, despite it all, there was something grounding about the quiet, something unspoken but understood between father and son. After a long pause, Daniel broke the silence, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You did right by me today, Elijah. You showed the world that men like Briggs won't be tolerated. And as long as there are people like you out there, maybe, just maybe, things will start to change. Elijah returned the smile, feeling a renewed sense of purpose stirring inside him. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for teaching me to stand up, to show respect, and to never back down. Daniel nodded, pride shining in his eyes. Anytime, son. Anytime. They sat together, watching the stars above as the night stretched on. Elijah knew the fight for justice, dignity, and respect wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as long as his father's quiet strength stood beside him, he was ready. One day at a time.